I usually look at Genesis as though it is a map. And the whole idea is, as you finish Genesis, you finish the map book. A map usually lays out the landscape and tells you where things are going. And really, by the time I get to the end of this book, it looks to me like the whole issue of chapter 50 is that the mature believer views his or her life as an opportunity for God to work through them, not as an opportunity to live for themselves. It's just a very normal surrender dialogue, if you will. And look at the first 3 verses of chapter 50, because I want you to see the setting. The setting is actually 1 to 13, but I want to zero in on the first part of the setting. I want you to see that there are stages of grief. By the way, if you don't know these, write them down. They're not just, I need you to understand, psychologists tell us there are 7 stages to grief, and you should at some point be acquainted with them. Okay? Look at verses 1 to 3. Somebody read the first 3 verses out loud.
Then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father, so the physicians embalmed Israel. Now 40 days were required for it, for such is the period required for embalming, and the Egyptians wept for him 70 days.
I want you to notice that these stages, spelled more properly than I did, are generally the stages you go through in loss. Now, I'm going somewhere with me, so be just a little bit patient, because it's all going to make sense in a minute, I hope. The first thing that happens when you lose someone who you love deeply is generally we go through a period that we react in sort of numbed disbelief. There's a muted shock that provides an emotional protection for our system in order to avoid the full pain. You do not go through grief all at one time. The best description I can give you is grief is like waves. It comes and goes. And you're fine until you find that there was this pen, and then there was this memory, and now you're sobbing. And you were fine until there was this spoon, and then there was this memory, and then you're sobbing. And the cat jumped a certain way, and the light went like this, and then you're sobbing. Waves that you need to understand that God provided a cushion. If you got hit with all of the pain of it right up front, you couldn't handle it. So there's a shock and a certain kind of denial, like what happens on a number of occasions I've had to tell children that their parents were dead. Generally, what do people do first? They don't believe you. No, come on, this isn't funny. If I haven't heard, I think I've heard that more times than I've heard anything else. This isn't funny. Now, you guys, you've only known me for like a month, but do I impress you as a guy who would come in and tell you something like that to be funny? The next one is pain and guilt. And this is as the shock of the initial denial starts to wear off, it's replaced by almost unbearable pain. And often people try to avoid it or escape with alcohol or drugs or guilty feelings, remorseful feelings tend to be normal at that point, and there tends to be a little bit of chaos that comes up in your mind. One of the things that happens is people often in that second stage, they feel like if only I hadn't asked them to go get ice cream, they wouldn't have been in the car accident. As if somehow your desire for ice cream is what caused the other person to do what they did. Really, when you think about it logically, it doesn't make sense, but when you're thinking about it through the pain of grief, it seems to fit. You're almost sure that it was somehow what you said 5 years ago that caused all of this to happen. You need to be careful because there's a lot of Christians running around with this sort of theology of the power in the word, as if you can like cause things to happen. Listen, don't elevate yourself. You're not quite as powerful as that. There's also another, there is a theology statement there, but we're going to come back and cover that later. I'm just saying you're not the one, because you said it, the sun, moon, and stars did not align today, okay? The third one is anger and bargaining. Who knows what the bargaining part of that is? Yeah, usually it starts off with lashing out, and then you're trying to find a way to balance it in your mind, because I want to be careful how I say it. Most of you are not irrational people, okay? If you are, the rest of us already know who you are. I'm kidding. Most of you really can get on a footing that's fairly good. But if you're talking about somebody who's deeply close to you, you can all of a sudden blame someone else, or you can start turning. One of the ways you can start bargaining your way out is people will do things like, I promise I'll never drink again if you just bring him back. And I have been in the room and listened to people verbalize those things. I'll do better, as if somehow you can bargain your way through the death process. Sometimes this happens even in a separation. And sometimes there's a glimmer of hope that that would take place, but it's not usually. Then there's what is called depressive reflection. Depressive reflection is just when you think you're getting past the pain, a period of sad reflection starts to overtake you. And encouragement from others is just not helpful to you during that stage, because in that stage of grieving, you start to understand the magnitude of your loss, and you get depressed. And the temptation to isolate yourself follows, reflecting on things you did when you were with them and how you had a good time with them and whatever. There's a reason I'm telling you this story. Everybody you know is going to go through this at some point. And you need to be able to gauge if you're going to effectively minister where they are. I need to be able to understand where people are at. Then there's, after that, something that you might not expect. There's an upward turn. By the way, if you take my brother's class down the street in Introduction to Psychology, you'll get the same list, okay? What happens is slowly your life starts to reshape and becomes a little calmer, and the depression starts to lift. Generally, this can be as much as 12 to 18 months later, where you start to feel like you're coming out of it. And then there's what's called reconstruction. Reconstruction is like an emotional rebirth. You start to feel again. I don't know if you know this, but for some people, they report as much as 12 to 18 months after they lose this dear person, they don't remember any feelings. They went through an entire time where they almost couldn't cry, they couldn't function. Normal things that should have made them happy, they were trumping up laughter. They couldn't really laugh. They weren't enjoying anything. Did you ever get depressed and even food didn't taste like anything? They go through a long, protracted period. Well, reconstruction is you start to shape some answers, and you start to practice some financial planning, and you start to get back into your life like you're alive again. But then there's still another stage, and that's acceptance and hope. And this is when somebody starts talking about the future again. You learn to accept and deal with the reality of the situation. You start looking toward the future, and you start understanding that you will live day by day, and that when you lose someone you love, you don't just get over it. That's not, and by the way, people are going to say the most inane things to you after a loss. And you're going to have to learn a whole new skill of forgiveness. How to forgive the 5 people who meant well and said really dumb things. Now, I tell you all that because Joseph fell on his father's face and he wept over him. He kissed him. He commanded his servants to embalm his father. Look at verse 3. 40 days were required for it, for such is the period required for embalming. And then the Egyptians all wept for him 70 days. You know what? In our society, we come back too fast. We think that the weekend after the funeral, okay, you've had time, now get... The better, more civilized cultures have taken time to mark a life and have taken time to sort it out. Now, for some of you, honestly, you're going to want to run back to work. Why? Why do some people need to get right back to work? It's a distraction. The problem is the only way to get to the other side of grief is through it. You cannot go around it by distracting yourself away from it. It will come up. So let me just say this. If you don't deal with it consciously, you'll deal with it subconsciously. You'll begin to make irrational decisions. And you will not make sense. And I'm telling you this to say you skip none of these steps. There is ample scholastic studies to show that these steps will happen in your life. So knowing what they are and anticipating them is helpful, because I can say, if I go through it, you're bargaining, Smith, you're bargaining, you can start to deal with your mind, and that's going to help you a great deal. Just remember this, grief and the whole process of grief is God's answer to you not exploding all on impact. It allows you to pass through the process. I think verses 1 through 3, what touches me is this is a time of incredible emotional pain, but it's also a time of vulnerability, and that's what verses 4 through 6 are about. Emotional pain's 1 through 3, vulnerability's 4 through 6. There's no question in my mind that Joe struggled to rein in his emotions, but he also strains to rein in his ego. He needed to go to Pharaoh and gain permission to follow through on what his father made him promise to do. The sharing must have been a deeply emotional event. So let me go back to verse 4. When the days of mourning for him were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, "If now I have found favor in your sight, please speak to Pharaoh, saying, my father made me swear, saying, behold, I am about to die. In my grave, which I dug for myself in the land of Canaan, there you shall bury me. Now therefore, please let me go up and bury my father, then I will return." Pharaoh said, "Go and bury your father as he made you swear." If you go to the religions of the East, and they're going to say to you that there's a cycle of reincarnation, and you're being punished in this life for some sin in a previous existence. But if you can find out which one of the thousands of gods you have angered, you might be able to appease his wrath. You might be able to get around the judgment of that God. If you sit down with your Arab friend, Islam has a different answer. Allah has willed it, and you have to learn to accept it without question. In the West, some people respond to tragedy by shaking their fist toward heaven and saying, "God, if you allow things like this, I reject you, I curse you. I don't ever want to have anything to do with you." Maybe some of you read Rabbi Kushner's book, Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good People? It became a bestseller. And he gives a different answer. He says, quote, "God is limited in his power, and therefore he is not a participant in our lives. Instead, he is a spectator watching us with interest." That, by the way, is totally nonsense. So what he's saying is God doesn't want bad things to happen to you, but he's not powerful enough to deal with it. That's an interesting way of looking at it, isn't it? So you got to understand that, God's loving and he's forgiving, but you got to forgive God for all his failures. He's just not quite as strong as he needs to be. This is what people are walking around with. Do you understand the strength and power that comes from knowing that there is a God in heaven and he doesn't owe me an explanation? I'm okay with sovereignty, meaning he's sovereign. Don't take that lightly. I recognize that I say it all the time, and you get used to hearing it, but the rest of the world thinks that's nonsense, it's cruel, it's harsh, it's wrong. How can he do that? And here's the thing. Look at their answers. Tell me they're better. Tell me the ones outside of Scripture are better than what you're hearing. What kind of God is not strong enough? He can make the earth, but he can't control it? He can create the fabric of history, but he doesn't. It's gotten away from him? Look at verse 7. It's also a time of responsibility. In the beginning of verse 7, Joe was incredibly healthy in Scripture, and we see him framing problems. He's just an ordinary man, but look at the loyalty. He says, "So Joseph went up to bury his father." So now he's doing this, but he's doing it out of responsibility. And then he goes into this family time, second half of 7 into 8. He goes into this family time. And with him went all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, all the elders of the land of Egypt, all the household of Joseph, and his brothers, and his father's household. They left only their little ones and their flocks and their herds in the land of Goshen. Even though the entire family came to Egypt, the area where the shepherding family of Joe was not near the prime minister's residence, and they all go carting off to go and bury this guy. This is remarkable. Look at that it becomes a public time. Look at verse 9 for a minute, because I want you to understand what's going to happen. You're going to lose somebody in your life. You're going to think it's private, and it's not going to be. It's public. You get about 10 minutes to mourn, and then you got to start taking guests coming through the line, and you got to start making it about them, because they're making it about them. Verse 9, there also went up with him chariots and horsemen. It was very great company, and when they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, they lamented there, and with a very great and sorrowful lamentation. And he observed 7 days mourning for his father. Now when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, they said, "This is grievous mourning of the Egyptians." Therefore they named it Abel Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim is the word for Egypt, actually, in Hebrew. Abel Mitzrayim, which is beyond the Jordan. Thus his sons did for him as he had charged them. So there's this public mourning, and then there's a little bit of memory time in verse 13. His sons carried him to the land of Canaan. They brought him to the cave of the field of Machpelah before Mamre, which Abraham had bought along with the field for a burial site from Ephron the Hittite. There's a memorable scene from Forrest Gump. Forrest's lifelong friend Jenny had grown up in a home where she had been abused by her father. And he had left his mark on Jenny in a horrible way, profoundly affecting her life choices. Now, years later, seeing that house, do you remember this? Did some of you remember this? They go back to the house, and the house where she grew up, the house from which she ran to a life that was even more destructive. And seeing that house brought back all these painful memories, and they're standing in front of the house. The hurt hadn't gone away. The wounds were never really healed. And Forrest appropriately comments, sometimes there just aren't enough rocks, because they're throwing rocks at the house. Sometimes there just aren't enough rocks. If you've ever returned to a place that you wanted to throw rocks at, that's an understandable reaction. Let me suggest to you that when you try to bury things that are deeply hurtful, they don't go away. They go under the things that are obvious. They're still there. That's one of the reasons God gives us a place to reconcile and to resolve. I would tell you not to bury it. I'd tell you to give it to him. I'm going to tell you that you're not going to be able to effectively bury it. I spent a lot of time with counseling with people who thought they buried things from years ago, but they're still there. How many of you know that you can subconsciously act on things that you no longer realize are driving you? How many of you know that there are lots of people doing that? Now, look at the problem in verse 14. Because when you're looking at a historical narrative, always look for the drama. Where's the drama? The drama is where the conflict is. Where's the conflict? Where the problem is. The external influence for peace was now gone. If Dad was the reason was gone. There's no reason for the pretense of any kind of relationship. Some people stay together for the children, but later in life, the siblings attempt to get along for the parents, and then the parents are gone, and then it breaks up. Look at verse 14. After he had buried his father. Now look what happens. The men feel particularly vulnerable. Now they're on Joseph's turf. You got to remember, Joe's there. They've buried Dad. Now everybody in the company who's armed is Egyptian. And Joe's in charge of the Egyptians. If you're one of the brothers, maybe you're thinking, Joe tolerated us. Joe took care of us because Dad was still alive. Now Dad's gone. Where's Joe, really? Joseph returned to Egypt, he and his brothers, and all who had gone up with him to bury his father. Now, there's two kinds of brothers going to be inside this picture. From verse 15 to 26, there are two kinds of brothers that we're going to see as this book closes. Some of the brothers are fear-filled. Some of them are faith-filled. I want you to see the two brothers. Go to verse 15 down to verse 17. and you have in the beginning some who are fear-filled. You know, some people act badly because of fear. They see their lives as subject to many forces beyond their control, and they don't have a root in God who's in control of all of them. So they're pressed by projection. What does projection mean? We've seen this before. What is projection? Yeah, you must be lying because I would be if I were you. You know, you must be trying. There's a trick here because I know that I'd be tricking you, so there must be a trick. That's projection, okay? Watch it in verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong which we did to him?" How could they conclude that? They never really believed that his forgiveness was real because their hearts weren't changed. When people don't forgive, they don't believe forgiveness. It's one of the reasons Jesus said, when you come and you ask me to forgive you, you need to forgive those who have harmed you. Why? Because if you don't forgive, you won't accept forgiveness really. That's why twice in the Gospels he says, you have to ask, as I've forgiven others, so I ask for your forgiveness. Now, some of the brothers operate in deception. Look at verse 16, verses 16 and 17. So they sent a message to Joseph saying, your father charged before he died, saying, thus you shall say to Joseph, please forgive, I beg you, the transgression of your brothers and their sin, for they did wrong. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. What are they doing? They're lying. Some of the brothers are operating in deception. They're telling a lie because they think the only way to save themselves is to tell a lie. You're going to find over and over and over people that think that God is not in control find lying to be their friend. Why? Because they feel like they can get more control when they can tell a lie that's going to angle the thing in the right direction as far as they can see. But you know what they're really doing? They're living out of weakness. Look at the second half of verse 17. Joseph went and spoke to them. Verse 18, then his brothers also came and fell down before him and said, behold, we are your servants. The brothers fall down. They're trembling because they thought the next moment would determine whether or not they were going to live or die or what their life would be like. They didn't act in love to serve. They acted out of fear to serve. The fear-filled guys. Now, switch gears. One brother was faith-filled. He was not fear-filled. He acted out of confidence. They're not controlled by fear when they act out of faith. They see their lives as subjected to God, who has all things in his firm control. So look at verse 17. Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Faith-filled people hurt because other people don't see clearly. If you're walking with God, you're liable to walk around hurt because other people don't see clearly. They're worried and hurt about what they think is going to happen. Guys, I have never seen churches like I'm seeing right now. People are afraid. Do you see it? They are afraid. If it's not ISIS, it's the government, it's taxes, it's the economy. People are afraid. And you know what? Churches are filled with fear-filled people and not faith-filled people. They've forgotten that God still is in control. They theoretically believe it, but they got to go out and vote to get it turned around. And they feel like the power is in the political polling booth, not in the prayer and the practice of your faith in front of people. I want you to vote, I want you to be active, but I don't want you to think that that's where the answers are. They're not there. They're going to drop balloons, and then they're going to go and do whatever they want to do. And you're going to be on for the ride, and they're going to promise you the world, and they're going to do what they want to do. Look, verse 17, he's weeping, and then it says, get down to verse 19, it says, Joseph said to them, do not be afraid. Am I in God's place? Underline that. That's it. You guys don't seem to get it. There's a God out there. I'm not God. I'm not in charge of whether you live or die. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. So therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and for your little ones. So he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. One of the biographers of Robert E. Lee tells about how after the Civil War was over And General Lee visited a Kentucky lady who showed him the remains of a large old tree in front of her house. She cried bitterly that its limbs and its trunk had been destroyed by Union artillery fire. She looked to Lee for a word condemning the soldiers of the North, or at least sympathizing with the loss of her tree. After a brief silence, Lee said, "Madam, cut it down and forget the tree." The point is, he knew if she didn't get rid of the bitterness, it would take root and poison the rest of her life. Every day she's going to look at that tree as a reason to be bitter. Cut it down. Probably the greatest general in American history. He suffered loss, and he went on to be okay with it. This was a guy who wept over both sides who fell, because he knew the guys he was shooting at. You got to be able to get to the place where you don't let the things that went wrong in your life determine the direction of your life. Matthew Rogers wrote, "God never puts a stamp of approval on evil and sin. What Joseph's brothers did was wrong, but Joseph looks back on his life and he sees it as no accident that he is where he is. Even in the midst of all the bad that happened, God still used it for good. In fact, he used Joseph's life to save many other lives. His brothers intended to harm him, but God intended to save them all." I think what's important is that Joseph was as good as his word to care for the family. Look at the verses that finish out the book. Joseph stayed in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph saw the third generations of Ephraim's sons, also the sons of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were born on Joseph's knees, meaning he was actually able to receive them. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am about to die, but God will surely take care of you and bring you up from this land to the land which he promised on an oath to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." I love that he lives out his faithfulness. I love that after all of the reasons he had to be abusive because he was abused, he simply said, "No, I'm not going to be that." I also love that he offered hope. Look at the end of the story, because it's a beautiful end. He lives out the truth of the values, and he never forgot where he came from. It says, Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, "God will surely take care of you. You will carry my bones up from here." So Joseph died at the age of 110 years. He was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. I would say this: live by God's promises, not by explanations. I'm pretty sure that at the bottom of the pit, Joseph wasn't fully aware of God's overall plan for his life. I'm pretty sure about that. I'm pretty sure that after being thrown into prison for something he didn't do, he probably still didn't see the whole picture. But by the time he lived to the end, he was living on God's promises, not explanations. He didn't need to know why God let things happen. You want to live on explanations? You will never be satisfied. This side of heaven, you will never be satisfied. So don't live on explanations. Do not demand God to come down and whisper in your ear why he's doing what he's doing. Because chances are good, like Job, you're not going to get it. But in addition to that, remember that the mature believer lives his life as an opportunity for God to work, not just as an opportunity for God to bless him. You have eternity to be blessed by God. If he gives you some hard bumps in this life, I'm not making light of them. I'm just saying if he gives you hard bumps in this life, you have eternity. He's good for whatever he charges you. Trust me, he will pay it all back. But you can't think of life in this frame only.